So now for our first panel, as I said, the National Debt and Entitlement Reform. Our panel chairman is Dr. Gary Wolfram. Gary is the William E. Simon Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Hillsdale College, and he is president of Hillsdale Policy Group, a consulting firm specializing in taxation and policy analysis. His public policy experience includes serving as Congressman Nick Smith's Chief of Staff and as Michigan's Deputy State Treasurer for Taxation and Economic Policy under Governor John Engler. He has also served as senior economist to the Republican Senate in Michigan. Gary received his PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley, and we don't hold that against him. He's also taught at Mount Holyoke College, the University of Michigan, and Washington State University. His publications include Toward a Free Society, An Introduction to Markets and the Political System, and several works on Michigan's tax structure and other public policy issues. He was named Hillsdale College's Professor of the Year for 2004, and as many of you know, he is an avid long-distance runner. Has been a runner for years and is one of Michigan's top 25 runners, and he has received that award. He and his wife, Mary, have 3 children. Please welcome Dr. Gary Wolfram.
Well, thank you all for coming. I think Anita wanted to test and see how many of us actually teach 8 o'clock classes when she scheduled this. And as for Berkeley, you know, people ask me about that, and I just say, well, as the Grateful Dead said, what a long, strange trip it's been. It's really difficult to think of an issue more important to our country's well-being than that which this panel is going to be addressing. And it's a very important issue. It's, the title is the National Debt and Entitlement Reform. And many of you might be old enough to be receiving emails from AARP. I can't say that I am, but I might have. But if you keep getting these things, you know that these issues are linked together. And how difficult it is going to be, and our panel is going to address this, how difficult it's going to be to try to deal with this problem. The unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare are larger than is our national debt, which itself is at record levels. Now, I like to use music analogies in my classes, and but one thing I've had to do is about 6 weeks ago, I started having a classic album of the week to let them know, because although Hillsdale College does teach you the Constitution, it seems to be lacking in rock and roll history. So I've taken that on myself. But some of you will remember Mary Ann Faithfull, and she had a song, Don't Make Promises You Can't Keep, and that would be a fitting subtitle for our panel. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to introduce all the panel members, and then they're going to come up in order. Then at each panelist will have about 20 minutes. In fact, Anita will tell you they have exactly 20 minutes. And then at the end, we will be able to have questions and answers, and it'll be the format as it was last night. There will be someone with a microphone. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and then someone with a microphone will come around and give you the mic. First of all, I'd like to introduce David Henderson. He's a research fellow with the Hoover Institute. He's also an associate professor of economics at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, which has nearly as good a weather as Hillsdale does. His writing focuses on public policy. His specialty is in making economic issues and analysis clear and interesting to a general audience, which makes him a fantastic professor as well. He's written several books, including The Concise Encyclopedia of Economics. He's a contributing editor for Reason and writes frequently for the Wall Street Journal and Fortune. He's also served as senior economist for energy and health policy with the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1982 to 1984. Born and raised in Canada, Henderson earned his Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics from the University of Winnipeg in 1970 and his PhD in economics from the University of California at Los Angeles in 1976. Michael Tanner will be following him, and he's a Cato Institute senior scholar and heads the research into a variety of domestic issues with emphasis on health care reform, social welfare policy, and Social Security. His most recent white paper, Bad Medicine, A Guide to the Real Costs and Consequences of the New Health Care Law, provides a detailed examination of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which goes by other anachronisms, including Obamacare, and what it means to taxpayers, workers, physicians, and patients. He's the author of Leviathan on the Right, How Big Government Conservatism Brought Down the Republican Revolution, which chronicles how the Republican Party shifted away from its limited government roots and warns that reforms are necessary. His other books include Healthy Competition, What's Holding Back Health Care and How to Free It, The Poverty of Welfare, Helping Others in Civil Society, and A New Deal for Social Security. Under Tanner's direction, Cato launched the Project on Social Security Choice, which is widely considered the leading impetus for transforming Social Security into a private savings program. Time magazine called him one of the architects of the private accounts movement, and Congressional Quarterly named him one of the nation's 5 most influential experts on Social Security. Dean Clancy is FreedomWorks Legislative Counsel and Vice President for Healthcare Policy. He studied government takeover of healthcare and is an acknowledged expert on budget and entitlement issues. At the White House Office of Management Budget from 2004 to 06, he was the top U.S. budget official for health policy and entitlement issues, overseeing half of the federal budget in dollar terms and more than 30 departments and agencies. From 2001 to 2004, he served as executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics, helped advise President Bush on stem cells, cloning, and similar issues. More recently, he served as Vice President of Government Affairs for KCI, a leading wound care products manufacturing company, and as a strategic advisor to congressional Republicans on the Senate staff of the Joint Economic Committee during the national health care debate. He considers his proudest accomplishments to be the shepherding of the Welfare Reform Act of 1996 into law and quietly saving billions of taxpayer dollars while at OMB. He hails from Aurora, Colorado, and holds degrees from Georgetown and Columbia, and resides with his wife and 4 children in Northern Virginia. So with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, and thank you, Gary, and thanks to Hillsdale for inviting me to speak before such a large audience. I'm quite excited about this. I want to dedicate this talk to a former boss of mine who died suddenly 2 days ago. Many of you probably know him, Bill Niskanen, who was chairman of the Cato Institute and was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors under Reagan when I was there working under him. I want to lead with 2 quotes. Countries do not go bankrupt. That's from Walter Wriston, former head of Citibank. Here's the second quote. There's a myth that floated around the banking community not many years ago that governments do not go bankrupt. I cannot imagine who dreamed that up. There's a ticking time bomb in the U.S. government's fiscal structure, growing government spending, which, if unchanged by policy, will result in growing government debt. This is not the short-run problem you hear about when you hear about the so-called super committee in Congress. It's the long-run problem that economists such as Lawrence Kotlikoff at Boston University and Jagdish Gokal at Cato Institute have been writing about for years. And the problem is this. 3 components of the federal government budget, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, are highly likely, essentially certain, to take an increasing share of gross domestic product, GDP. Overall, federal government spending, including interest on the debt, could well hit over 40% of GDP by 2050. To put it in perspective, it's typically been around 20% for the last 20 years, the last 60 years, 21%. On the other hand, government revenues, have averaged about 18% of GDP for the last 16 years, never going much below 16% and never going much above 20%. So the result, if governments don't change policy, would be annual deficits of approximately 20% of GDP, which in today's dollars would make it a $3 trillion deficit. It reminds me of the bumper sticker that I saw when the Tea Party got active. Don't tell Obama what comes after $1 trillion. The question then becomes, what will change? And that's hard to predict. And so I'm giving my predictions in decreasing order of certainty. First, federal government revenues are unlikely to go over 22% of GDP for more than a few years. That's my big good news today. You'll see it has other implications, but I think that's good news. Second, well before spending reaches 30% of GDP, let alone 40%, the federal government will face a renewed, more serious fiscal crisis. Third, likely cuts in Medicare and Medicaid would at best delay, not prevent this crisis. Fourth, the probability, therefore, is very high that at some point the U.S. federal government will default on its debt. And fifth, outright default on the federal debt will occur despite any increasing inflation. In other words, I don't think the default is going to be by inflation. It could be, but that's not the main thing. So how did we get where we got? Let me just summarize a whole lot of years, the last 60 years of federal government spending. Throughout the 50s, defense spending was over half of all federal government spending. As I said, federal government spending has remained around 20% of GDP, so what changed? Defense spending fell as a percent of GDP, and things like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security rose, almost in mirror image. To put it succinctly, federal government spending has moved dramatically away from guns toward butter. And as you might know, the two programs, Medicare and Medicaid, were started by President Johnson. In 2009, federal government spending on Medicare and Medicaid alone totaled over 5% of GDP, or about a quarter of the U.S. government budget. It wasn't just Johnson, though. Johnson and Nixon added substantially to Social Security benefits. Together, they raised benefits in their times in office by 72%. When Wilbur Cohen, Johnson's Secretary of HEW, said he wanted a 10% hike in Social Security benefits, Johnson said, "Come on, Wilbur, you can do better than that." Nixon added to it by increasing benefits by 20% when he was worried about competing with Wilbur Mills in the 1972 presidential election. So why are these things rising? Social Security spending is rising due to demographics. I mean, we aren't going to see those big increases ever again, but we started from that big level Johnson and Nixon put us at, and we're going up from there. Medicare spending is rising due to demographics, and one very important, actually pretty neat fact about healthcare spending: they can actually do things now. 60 years ago, doctors essentially diagnosed. You sat in the hospital and died, or didn't die, but they didn't do much about it. And now they can do things. And if you've, I'm sure a lot of you have followed the kinds of things they do now. In the interest of time, I'm not going to list them all off. Of course, the mere fact that you can do something medically doesn't mean you will do it, but if the government is paying for it, you're likely to. And with Medicare, people are generally spending other people's money. And we always spend other people's money much more generously than we spend our own. Medicaid spending is rising for the same reason. Although, by the way, there were some major increases in Medicaid coverage in the late 1980s, as David Stockman, who was OMB director, made these short-run, really bad trade-offs, in my view, giving Henry Waxman from Southern California big increases in spending in the future in return for tiny cuts in the present. And so the net effect has been a massive increase in Medicaid spending over those 10 years, and then, again, we're going up from that level. Moreover, a huge component of Medicaid spending is for nursing home coverage. And again, we go back to demographics. There are a lot more people taking advantage of that. How about projected spending? The numbers in the future are positively scary. 3 years ago, the Congressional Budget Office, a relatively nonpartisan scorer of government budgets, projected that in 2050, Social Security would be 6% of GDP, Medicare 8.9%, and Medicaid 3.1%. That means they would take up 18% of GDP. Remember, all of the federal government is typically 20% of GDP. So that leaves 2%, if you wanted to stick at 20, 2% for everything else, defense, other things government does, and interest on the debt. So, of course, there's just no way. Now, the most striking fact about federal government revenues of all kinds since 1950, and I said this, but I want to emphasize it, is that except in 1 year, they've never exceeded 20% of GDP. And in that 1 year, the year 2000, they were 20.5% of GDP. In the 62 years from 1950 to 2011, federal revenues have averaged 17.7% of GDP. In recession years, they tend to be lower as a percent of GDP, mainly because as real income declines, revenues decline even more, and because governments tend to follow Keynesian policies of tax cuts during recessions. So in 2011, for example, not literally a recession year, but a slow growth year, federal revenues are 14.4% of GDP, the lowest they've been in over 60 years. And let me show you what the, that graph there, on the left-hand side is 1950, on the right is 2010. It looks like it bounces around a lot, but remember the base there is 14, not 0. So it's bouncing around generally around 18% of GDP, up or down a point or two. Now that's a kind of an amazing fact. What it says is, given all the tax rate cuts and tax rate increases that have happened over those 60 years, bracket creep due to inflation, we've still stayed within this relatively narrow range. You might think there's an iron law of economics that says it's economically impossible for the federal government to take more than 20% of GDP in revenues. And indeed, Kurt Hauser formulated such a law, wrote it up in the Wall Street Journal and called it Hauser's Law. I don't buy that. And in my paper, which I don't know if I have time to go through the reasoning totally, but let me try. When government raises tax rates, it discourages growth. So if we're taking tax revenues over GDP, GDP is a little lower. Therefore, tax revenues ought to go higher as a percent of GDP. There is a Laffer curve effect, but it's got to be a very, very strong Laffer curve effect to make tax revenues go down as much as GDP did. So Hauser's explanation really doesn't explain it. So I don't think there's an iron law of economics that says that, but I do think there's an iron law. It's an iron law of politics. We have in this country essentially a political equilibrium where revenues can't go much below 17% of GDP for very long and can't go much above 19% of GDP for very long. Why is that so? I'm not totally sure, but I don't think I have to be sure to say there's this equilibrium there, there's this iron law. So that has, and let me just point to one administration where we can see that iron law in practice. In this one administration that is still talked about by some economists and historians as if it was entirely a tax-cutting regime, and it wasn't, we see that in practice, and I'm referring, of course, to the 2 terms of Ronald Reagan. Reagan came into office when high inflation had been combining with unindexed tax brackets, not indexed for inflation, to drive revenues very high. In 1981, for example, revenues were at a relatively high 19% of GDP. In response, Reagan introduced his tax bill, I think one of the best tax bills ever, to cut marginal tax rates starting in late 1981 in stages through 84, and then to implement inflation indexing in 85. But, as Ronald Reagan used to say, let's take a trip down memory lane. As soon as the summer of 1982, Reagan reversed course and successfully pushed Congress to moderate and even reverse some of the tax cuts. Reagan also increased taxes substantially in 1983 and 1984. Similarly, on the other end, a president who tried to increase taxes, as President Clinton did successfully in 1993, sets in motion forces that try to moderate the tax increase. We see those same forces in the opposite direction in the Clinton administration. We got a substantial tax cut in 1997 out of Clinton. So I really do think there's an iron law there. Let me look to the future. I think the most important relevant political economic fact, the thing I'm surest of in all the things I've talked about, is that tax revenues will not go over 22% of GDP for more than a year or two, and I don't even think they'll hit that. But by 2050, as I noted, the CBO projects that those three programs will take 18% of GDP. Other non-interest federal programs, they predict, will take 7.6% of GDP, down from 9.9% today in 2007. And the interest in the federal debt will grow. The result, by 2050, federal spending is projected to reach 41.8% of GDP, roughly double the average of the last 60 years. But couldn't the federal government turn things around by cutting discretionary spending substantially now and implementing changes in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that would substantially reduce their rate of growth? Sure, they could. And the recent attempts by Republicans in Congress are a step in the right direction. Moreover, two prime ministers in Canada, where I was born, Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, both of the welfare statist Liberal Party, did just that between 1994 and 2006. They brought Canada's debt to GDP ratio down from 70% to 30%. They did have the advantage of working in a parliamentary system where what the Prime Minister says goes, and we don't have that advantage. Still, we did have some success in the 90s, so it's possible. The problem is politicians tend to want to kick the can down the road, making it someone else's problem and not really solving these things. I remember in the famous Atlantic Monthly interview of David Stockman in 1981 that got him in so much trouble, one thing that no one highlighted except me in a couple of articles was Stockman was asked how come he went for these short-run Social Security cuts rather than long-run, maybe increase the age at which people got Social Security and so on. And he said, quote, in 1981, he said, quote, "Why should I solve the problem of the guy who has this job in 2010? Guess what? It's now 2011. Well, things that can't go on forever, as my former boss at the Council of Economic Advisors when I was a summer intern in the Nixon administration, my former boss Herb Stein said, things that can't go on forever don't. So they'll stop. How will they stop? We don't know. But it will take very substantial reforms very soon to turn it around. And I guess I'm not very, very optimistic about that. Now, many people actually my paper is co-authored with Jeff Humlin. We've made this case to others. And many people look at our numbers and agree with our case. And they say the way it's going to happen is that the government will do it by printing money. They'll essentially default on the debt by inflating it away. That's possible. But what I point out in this paper is it doesn't work. I don't just mean you get high inflation. I mean the government can't make enough money with high inflation to make much of a dent. The money the government makes with high inflation is called seigniorage. And seigniorage has been falling. Even in the great inflation of the 1970s, seigniorage was below 2% of federal expenditures, or less than 0.5% of GDP. That's partly the result of globalization, in which international competition disciplines central banks. But it was also the result of sophisticated financial systems with fractional reserve banking, in which most of the money people actually hold is created privately by banks and therefore the government doesn't get any revenue on it. So seigniorage has become a trivial source of revenue, and not just here, but in most other countries. You have to have a very unsophisticated banking system, such as in Zimbabwe, for seigniorage to make much of a dent. So that doesn't mean it won't happen, but if we do a straight line extrapolation, it would say that the only way the government could make enough money with seigniorage is to have an annual inflation rate of 246%. I don't think that's likely. I think people would resist that more than they would resist the government defaulting on the debt when you consider that the government is defaulting on people in China and Japan and so on who can't do much about it. So how might such a default unfold? The financial structure of the United States government currently has a nominal firewall between Treasury debt and the government's unfunded liabilities provided by the trust funds of Social Security, Medicare, and other programs. These give investors the illusion that the shaky fiscal status of social insurance has no direct effect on the government's formal debt. But according to the latest intermediate projections of the trustees, the hospital insurance Medicare Part A trust fund will be out of money in 2024, whereas the Social Security trust funds will be empty by 2036. So if the government starts dipping into general revenues, the firewall is gone. If investors then respond by requiring a risk premium on treasuries, the unwinding could move very fast, much like the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union or the more recent fiscal crisis in Greece. Politicians will be unable to react fast enough to close the gap, and for the U.S. government, unlike Greece's, there's no one left to bail us out. Now, this is a kind of a sobering talk, right? And here I am smiling. What am I smiling about? I'm smiling about one thing. Two things. One is I really do believe that iron law. In other words, government can't spend what they don't have, and if they can maybe raise 20 or 22% of GDP in revenue, and that'll be it. And default isn't all bad. Think about I bet a lot of people in this group would like to see a balanced budget amendment. One of the big problems we have with the balanced budget amendment is it doesn't have teeth. How do you enforce it? If Congress wants to borrow, how do you stop them? Send them to jail? Yeah. But who's going to send them to jail? The president? So default, I'll leave you with this thought, this little bit of optimism. Default on the debt is a balanced budget amendment with teeth.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that I have the opportunity to follow the optimistic speech. Because usually before mine, they take away your belt and shoelaces and any sharp objects. At any rate, I do, before I start, to thank Hillsdale for giving me a chance to come here, back to Atlanta. I actually was here in Atlanta for a couple of years with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation before I went to Cato, so love Atlanta. We're all, as you all know, I mean, if you read Paul Krugman, you know that we're living in a new age of austerity. And that the federal government is starved for money because those intransigent Republicans in the House have refused to go along with raising taxes and spending. We went through a near government shutdown, if you recall, back in May over the continuing resolution, and then we almost defaulted on the debt with the debt ceiling increase, and as a result of this, we have slashed to the bone government spending. And, you know, It might surprise you, therefore, to learn that actually federal government spending this year is up by 5%. It's up about $120 billion this year over the first 9 months of the year. And as a result of that, of course, we've been borrowing that $120 billion, so our deficit is actually up this year. So and it might not be quite as austere as Dr. Krugman thinks. The other thing, of course, you know, if you've picked up the newspapers at all recently, is that there is this huge crisis going on in Europe, that they just managed, in fact, to bail out Greece a couple of days ago. And, you know, they're having this huge crisis because in Europe, the welfare states there have run up these enormous debts that they can't possibly pay. They're in danger of defaulting. Governments there are actually going broke. And, you know, fortunately, that could never happen to us. Well, I'd like to take a little look at that and try and put us in sort of perspective of what's going on in some of those countries. If we, can we put that up on the screen? Do we have the slides? It's on here. It's not on over there. There it is. This is deficits as a percent of GDP. And U.S. here is the light line over on the side there. And I just wanted to point out that as a percentage of GDP, our current deficit is higher than that of any country in the EU. Our current deficit as a percent of GDP is just under 11%, which is higher than the deficit in Greece as a percentage of their GDP. So we're running a bigger deficit right now than Greece is. And then, of course, if you want to look at it as a matter of debt, the deficit being how much we're overspending irresponsibly this year, the debt is an accumulation of how much we've irresponsibly overspent from past years combined. Our debt is somewhere just under 100%. It's actually 98%, I believe, of GDP as of last month, which puts us, fortunately, we're not the worst in the world. Greece and Italy are worse than us. We're the third worst country in the world when it comes to debt as a percent of GDP. We're number 3. But we're rising. You know, we've got hope for the future. You know, we'll get there. We'll overtake them. But, you know, in debt, when we talk about, we have debt this month, actually, by the end of this month, we will hit $15 trillion in national debt in this country. And we will be at about 100% of GDP. I mean, think about that. You know, we will owe an amount equal to everything that this country produces over the course of a year. But that's actually the good news. Because when you look at debt, there are actually 3 different types of debt that's out there. When a government has debt, it actually runs debt in a couple of different ways. The first of these, the one that economists sort of take most seriously, is debt to the public. This is the debt that government owes to people. It owes it, you know, it's in the debt it owes to you if you have a government bond. It owes it to China. It owes it to businesses, state and local governments who bought government bonds. But it's the debt that someone holds. And government often thinks of this as the most, or economists think of this as the most important debt because, first of all, it's the most real debt. This is in the absence of a default. It's the debt that's hardest to default on, that you're supposed to actually have to pay back to somebody. It is debt that squeezes out borrowing in the private sector, so it has the impact there on interest rates and things like this. This is debt that people worry about. And we are at the highest ratio of debt, public debt to GDP that we've had. It's around 60-some-odd% right now, and it's considered one of the highest since post-World War II, considered a serious problem. The second type of debt is what's called intragovernmental debt. This is money that the government owes itself, in effect. It's money that the government has in the various trust funds and revolving accounts and things like that. Most of that money is held in two accounts, the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund, but it's also in the Highway Trust Fund, things like that. This is money that the government basically is going to have to pay back at some point to itself in order to continue to pay benefits that's out there. You know, the Social Security Trust Fund, we often get this huge debate in Washington. It's a wonderful food fight about, is the Social Security Trust Fund real? You know, one side talks about, oh, they've diluted the Social Security Trust Fund, and the other side says, no, you know, it's a government debt. It's out there. It sits in a vault in West Virginia. It's the Bob Byrd Memorial Vault. And you know, it's actually there. I mean, it really is. There's government bonds. There's a little filing cabinet. They have the government bonds in there. They're right next to the Confederate war bonds. You know, in reality, I always say, you know, it doesn't make any difference. You know, it's totally irrelevant to the Social Security system or to the federal government. I mean, when you think about it, if Social Security didn't have a trust fund, what would happen? It's about 7 years from now, 6 years from now, Social Security's going. Actually, Social Security right now is running a cash flow deficit, and so what they have to, if they didn't have a trust fund, in order to pay the benefits, they'd have to go back. You know, they'd have to raise taxes or borrow money from China or find money somewhere in the budget and pay it. Well, they've got this trust fund. They go out to West Virginia and they take one of the bonds out of the Bob Byrd vault and they cash it in. And where do they get the money to repay it? Well, they raise taxes or they borrow it or they find it somewhere on the budget. It's exactly the same thing. So this is debt just like any other debt they have. And then finally, there's this what's called an implicit debt that governments have. This is the debt where we've promised benefits under Social Security and Medicare. And we know there's not enough tax revenue that's going to come in which to pay those obligations, and you have that shortfall. Now, some people say, well, that's not real debt, but the fact is, under current law, it is. I mean, those benefits are in the books. They are the benefits that current law says you must pay. And you don't have the revenues to pay them, so you have this debt. Now, you can default on them much easier than defaulting on the government bonds because you can always change those benefit formulas, but somebody would actually have to come in to do that. You'd actually have to raise the retirement age or change benefit formulas or do something in the future. But if you don't do it, if you just keep the current level of benefits under current law and you have the current level of taxes that are coming in, eventually you're going to have to change that implicit debt over to explicit debt. You're going to have to find money with which to continue to pay those benefits, which means borrowing it, which means you're going to run up debt that's going to be more explicit, going to be more on the books debt. So when you look at the actual indebtedness of a country, if you wanted to look at the balance sheet of a country, what you would actually want to look at is not just the on-the-books debt, that is debt held by the public and intergovernmental debt, the debt we sort of think of as the $15 trillion national debt. What you actually want to look at is the total indebtedness of a country, which includes both that on-the-books debt but also this implicit debt, the unfunded obligations of its pension systems and its healthcare systems. It's not something just that the U.S. has. This is a problem in these European countries as well. They have unfunded pension obligations that are all over the place. In fact, some of the countries that look pretty good today, like Germany, because they have fairly low national debts, have enormous unfunded obligations of their pension systems, their retirement systems going forward that are in hundreds of % of their GDP. Going forward. So they are really, in the long term, in enormous problems. Well, how do we stack up if you actually want to look at that? We're number one. Over at the end there, you can barely see it on the way the slides are here, but our total debt, counting both the national debt that's on the books and the unfunded obligations we face under Social Security and Medicare, are 900% of GDP. Roughly $120 trillion. That's trillion with a T. That's the discounted present value of those obligations, by the way. So if we only had $120 trillion today that we could stick in the bank and earn a 3% rate of interest, we could pay off all our bills. Unfortunately, the federal government hasn't got a spare 120 trillion laying around out there. In fact, one of the things to just put this in perspective, right now we have all those folks out there on Wall Street, and there's an Occupy Atlanta, I understand, and they're occupying Tacoma Park, where I'm from, but that's the whole town, pretty much. But they say all we have to do is tax the rich, and we can solve this problem. Well, if you were not just to tax the rich, but you were to confiscate every penny owned by every millionaire and billionaire in America, you would get about $12 trillion. We owe $120 trillion. So you wouldn't come close to dealing with the problem. And once again, just pointing it out here, Greece, which is considered the basket case of Europe, is just about in the same boat as us. But we are much worse off in terms of total indebtedness than countries like the Netherlands or Portugal or Spain or Italy that are considered to be in crisis in Europe today. So the question becomes, can we continue to go on the way we're going on? Moreover, I would suggest to you that the debt isn't even the problem. The debt is just a symptom of the disease. Milton Friedman used to point out that it's not debt versus taxes that's the issue. The cost of government is how much government spends. And it doesn't really matter whether you finance that through debt or higher taxes. There's distributional aspects of it and what have you, but you both are taking resources out of the productive sector of the economy and turning them over to the unproductive sector of the government. And so what you really want to look at is how much does government spend? And as you just heard from David, if you look out to around 2050, under current CBO projections, the federal government will be spending 42% of GDP. And from there, it goes to numbers that are just inconceivable. I mean, 64% of GDP before the end of the century spent by the federal government. And that's just the federal government. State and local governments traditionally spend another 10 to 15% of GDP. So what you could end up with is government at all levels in this country consuming somewhere around 60% of GDP by the middle of the century. Now think about that. 60 cents out of every dollar that's produced in this country would be consumed by the government. I mean, at some point you do cease to become a free economy. And again, just to put this in perspective, if you want to match that up, we think of the socialized states of Europe. We think of, the welfare states of Europe. And they do have, they consume an enormous amount of their economies. The government consumes an enormous amount of economies in Europe. Well, if you look at where we would be around 2050, consuming at all levels of government close to 60%, we would be the second biggest government as a percentage of economy in the world compared to where Europe is today. I mean, we think of France, France, the socialized country over there, that we all compare ourselves to. We would be spending more, or have the government be spending a larger percentage of our economy than France is today. So we would be more socialized than any of the welfare states of Europe if we keep going down the path that we're going down. Now, when we talk about why are we heading down that, as you heard, it's largely a matter of the entitlement programs that we face. I mean, people talk about we're going to make cuts in Washington, and everybody's going to find fraud, waste, and abuse, and they're going to cut fraud, waste, and abuse out of Washington. The problem is you can't get there from here. Domestic discretionary spending, which is where all that fraud, waste, and abuse is going to come from, amounts this year to $650 billion. Now, deficit we're running is this year will be $1.3 trillion. That means you could abolish all domestic discretionary spending. Everything, the Department of Education, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy that you're going to hear about coming up, the FDA, the FBI. I mean, it's a libertarian dream. And we'd still have a $650 billion deficit this year. Now, defense is another 19% of federal spending, so you could throw that in, and we'd still have a deficit. The fact is, you can't get there from here unless you're willing to deal with the entitlement programs of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. But no politician right now is willing to touch those programs. Oh, we do have, big debate over whether or not it's a Ponzi scheme, and but if you really look at it, what proposals are out there on the books right now, or seriously being considered for dealing with these programs? And I would suggest to you that there aren't any. Oh, there's some trims here and there, but no structural reforms. And unless we're willing to do those type of structural reforms, to fundamentally change the nature of Medicare and Social Security, then we're headed down that road that turns us into one of those welfare states like Europe. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into details of how I would reform them, but I would suggest that ultimately, both Medicare and Social Security are going to have to be changed from programs that are essentially Ponzi schemes with a gun. People ask me, is Social Security a Ponzi scheme? And I would suggest it would have been if Charles Ponzi had had a gun. Because the difference is Ponzi schemes go broke when you can't convince people to keep giving money as the deal gets worse and worse, and eventually can't convince people to give them any more money. The federal government doesn't have that problem. No matter how bad a deal Social Security gets, they can force you to contribute. And the same with Medicare. But unless we change these from simple transfer programs in which what we do is take money from working people and give it to retired people, and no investment takes place, and no savings takes place, and no economic growth takes place, then ultimately the systems break down, and you end up with the type of debt and the type of deficits that I've been talking about. So ultimately, you have to change the nature of these programs, and that is going to require a level of political courage that is fundamentally missing in Washington, in terms of Congress, but also in terms of the presidential campaign that we're currently seeing. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, who here wants to do something about the problems that have been outlined this morning? All right. Well, that's what we in the Tea Party movement are determined to do. We don't trust Washington to solve this problem, this crisis, but we do believe, we are hopeful that the American people can solve it. It was mentioned that I'm with FreedomWorks. My name is Dean Clancy again. And just to clarify where I'm coming from, I've been with the Tea Party movement since 1773. And now I spend my time going around the country talking to people about the budget and about health care, replacing Obamacare, and saving our country. So what I'm going to do here is give you a little taste of what we do as we go around the country talking to folks about this through a process we call the Tea Party Debt Commission. And it's going to be interactive, so be prepared to do a little bit of town hall here with me in a minute. A little bit about FreedomWorks. We are a national grassroots organization of more than 1 million, we're now approaching 2 million members dedicated to the principles of lower taxes, less government, and more freedom. That's what we do. And FreedomWorks is different from other conservative organizations in that we're not about just educating. We're doing that. That's why I'm here today. But we're about the ground game, get out the vote, elections. We believe that politics goes to those who show up. So our business is to make sure people do show up and that they're armed with the right information that will help them make choices that will send people to Washington and your state legislature that actually change policy in the direction that you think it should. So we send out door hangers and yard signs. We give people walking maps. We give people information, as I said. That's what we're about. The Tea Party Debt Commission is a process designed to help people understand the budget, and it's our way of hearing from them what they think Washington should do. We're going to be unveiling a Tea Party budget on November 17th in a joint House-Senate hearing, and it's going to be pretty exciting. Unlike the super committee, we're going to save, the super committee is supposed to save $1.2 trillion over 10 years. Our budget plan is going to save $9 trillion over 10 years. And the difference is our plan is going to be able to actually balance the budget, actually shrink government, actually stop the debt from accumulating, and therefore avert the future that my two predecessor speakers have described. The politics of entitlement reform, which is the title of my talk, is difficult, clearly, because, whoops, my slides are showing. Can we turn the slides off? Thank you. The politics of entitlement reform is difficult for three reasons, I think. Entitlements represent, for folks, first of all, security. People like the fact that they're guaranteed something. Second, it represents justice for many people. Hey, this is my money coming back to me. I paid in. And finally, welfare. People like getting free money from the government. And when you combine those things with a misperception that this is also a legally vested right, legally enforceable property, the courts will protect me from the legislature with respect to this money, then you have a very politically powerful combination, and it becomes a real difficulty to touch these programs. Medicare and Social Security are the largest federal programs, the fastest growing, and because of these reasons I just mentioned, they're very hard to deal with, and yet we have to if we're going to avert the Greece-style debt crisis that we're facing. Now, I want to differ from one of my predecessor speakers, David Henderson. I agreed with everything he said. His talk was excellent. But he said there's an iron law that in this country we simply will not pay more than 20, 21, 22% of the economy in taxes to our federal government. I don't believe that law is made of iron. It might be a tin law, it might be aluminum, but it's not iron, and I have two reasons for saying that. First, in the 19th century, the idea that we would have supported the kind of government we have today, 25% of the economy being consumed by the federal government, people would have drawn their six-shooters on you to even suggest such a thing. The culture has changed. Our politics has changed. The relationship between citizen and government has been changed by the progressive revolution and a whole century now of the unfolding of those sets of ideas. And then the second reason I don't believe it's an iron law is because the Europeans look to be our future if we continue on our current course. And now I would like to pull up the slides. Okay. I have a technical difficulty. The slide is not expanding. Hold on. All right, I think we're getting it. Thanks for your patience. This, whoops, it's the wrong slide though. That's the slide I want. This is the second reason I don't believe in an iron law of maximum taxes. The blue line at the bottom of this slide is the amount of the economy our federal government collects in revenues since 1965. And David Henderson is absolutely right. It never goes above about 18% of the economy. And it doesn't matter how high the income tax top rate is. It could be 90% as it was in the 40s and 50s. It could be 70% as in the 60s. 50% as in the 80s. Ronald Reagan got it down to 28% before he left office. Today it's crept back up to 35%. It doesn't matter. We always collect the same amount in taxes. It's because people shift money offshore, they go underground, they exploit tax shelters, loopholes, and so on. And so that part of the law is iron. People do evade paying more than about that amount. But look at that red line. Or maybe it's not clear that it's red. The higher line, that's Europe. They collect today over 40% of their economies, the big countries of the continental Europe. 40%. Twice the tax take of this country. Why is that? They have something called a value-added tax on top of steeply graduated income taxes. They found a machine that politicians can use to raise enough revenue to consume that much of the economy, and people can't evade it. People try to evade taxes in Europe, too. Their culture is different, but they don't like paying taxes any more than we do, really. And so that's our future, I believe, if we do nothing. But, of course, we're trying to do something. Next slide, last slide. This is our budget, and we try to educate people around the country about the composition of the budget. As you can see on the left, 3 programs constitute 40% of our budget: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. As it happens, our deficit right now is about 43%. We're borrowing 43 cents out of every dollar we spend. If we just lopped off those 3 programs, eliminated them today, our budget would be balanced. We're raising enough revenue to pay for everything else on that slide to the right of that central line. Defense is about 20% of the budget. Net interest, about 5 or 6%. Income security, which is entitlement programs like food stamps and unemployment, the EITC, housing assistance, that's another about 20% of the budget. And then when you get down to the lower right corner of that slide, you have most of what we think of as government: FEMA, HUD, Commerce, State, Transportation, State Department, you name it. I like to always point out the little pink area there about halfway down on the very far right-hand side. I'm pointing to it with my laser pointer. That's foreign aid. A lot of Tea Party audiences are a little surprised to learn that half of our budget isn't given to foreign countries. And you can't balance the budget by cutting foreign aid, or, incidentally, by eliminating earmarks, or by cutting illegal aliens off from government programs, or by cutting out pork, or waste, fraud, and abuse. All of those are good things, but the fact is you do have to go to entitlements to solve the problem long term. Now that's the end of my slides. So if we could turn that off, thank you. Now let's go into the town hall section of my talk. Let me set that up. The Tea Party Debt Commission is gathering information from folks. We're trying to do this different from Washington. The Super Committee is an insider game. 12 powerful members of Congress, appointed by 4 powerful members of Congress: Reid, Pelosi, McConnell, and Boehner. And it's got a lot of power because its bill will get an up or down vote, no amendments, no extended debate or filibuster. A lot of power. Now, they're probably going to fail, or they're going to come up with something disappointing. And even if they meet their charge of $1.2 trillion, it's not going to solve the problem. It's really a pittance. It will reduce 10-year spending from $44 trillion to $43 trillion. Yay! So that's why we're trying to do something different. And as we go around talking to people, we're taking their ideas. What would they do to solve this problem? Also online, we're taking submissions, and you can submit at info@teapartydebtcommission.com. And finally, this online survey, which I'm about to show you. In fact, we're going to take the survey together. And what we're doing with that survey is getting a sense of people's priorities. Assuming we have to cut, and the debt crisis is coming, so we're going to have to make choices. What would you cut first? Okay, let me see if I can set this up. Okay, is it up? All right, so you come to our website, Tea Party Debt Commission, and then you click here. All right. It's not very responsive, but you come to this website, teapartydebtcommission.com, and now what you do is, and I'll explain, you're going to be given a series of pairs of randomly selected budget cuts. We have a database in here of potential budget cuts which we've taken from various plans. Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, the budgets proposed by Paul Ryan and Rand Paul and the House Conservatives and so on and so on. And we randomly pair two cuts and you have to pick one. You can't pick both, though a lot of people would like to do that. And you can't pick zero, you got to pick one, because this is about priorities. And each one tells you how much money you're going to save. And at the end of the process, about 8 or 10 pairs, it'll tell you how much money you saved over 1 year and 10 years. And we're going to do this. And then I'm going to give you some interesting information about what we're finding, because a lot of people have done this. 50,000 people have visited this site. 40,000 have actually clicked all the way through and completed it, submitted their email, and hit submit. And that's incredible, 80% retention rate. People care about this, and the results are very fascinating. Okay, let's go ahead and do it. Okay, we're getting started. And now we have our first pair. Do we want to eliminate the Department of Energy and transfer the nuclear portion to the Defense Department, or do we want to end the welfare portion of the child tax credit program? You can see the numbers. I don't know if they're large enough for you to read. $210 billion for energy, $265 billion for child credit payments over 10 years. Okay, show of hands. Who would rather get rid of the Department of Energy? Okay, child credit payment. Energy loses. Okay, next. Social Security retirement, raise the retirement age to 70. It's currently on its way to going up to 67, so we'd raise it even more. For people born after 1951, that includes me. Or should we reduce Social Security benefits for those with high incomes? Means test. Okay, retirement age, means test. Okay, I think retirement age wins. So we just saved $56 billion in the first 10 years. Eliminate farm subsidies, or remove the cap on how much the government recoups in SSI overpayments. SSI is like a welfare program run through Social Security. Farm subsidies, SSI. Okay, boy, this is a hardcore audience. Farm subsidies are gone. No farmers apparently here. Okay, you can see by the bar there we're about halfway done. Flood insurance, get rid of national flood insurance for people who live, in areas with repeatedly flooded homes, or block grant cash welfare. We reformed welfare in 1996, but there's plenty more welfare programs that could be block granted. Okay, flood insurance, see hands, or cash welfare. That's the big winner there. All right, cash welfare. All right, eliminate the ethanol tax credit. Okay, I take it there's a lot of ethanol fans here. Eliminate ethanol tax credit or block grant food stamps. Food stamps, show your hands. Ethanol, show your hands. Okay, whoa, ethanol is really unpopular. Okay, eliminate the National Endowment for the Arts, which is rather small savings, or eliminate the Legal Services Corporation, also modest. Legal Services, National Endowment for the Arts. Oh, about equally divided. I'm going to say NEA goes. Someone voted twice. Oh, yeah. Well, we're not writing your names down, and no one goes to jail. Federal employee travel, cut that, or reduce discretionary spending back to the 2008 level before the current Obama surge. There's, I think, a big disparity in savings there. Discretionary spending would save a lot more money. Okay, cut federal employee travel, discretionary spending, okay, almost unanimous. Eliminate mass transit grants or eliminate all earmarks. Mass transit grants, earmarks. Whoa, earmarks. Whoops, okay, so what have we saved? On our first year, we've saved $110 billion. Congratulations, you did that without breaking a sweat. And over 10 years, we've saved $1.7 trillion, half a trillion more than the super committee is being asked to do. And I would ask you, if we did all of those policy changes that we just agreed to as a game, would the world have ended? No. So the point is, this can be done. We can get popular support. Now let's look at the results from the public. Okay. Here they are, the top 10 budget cuts based on the 40,000 people who've done this so far. Number 1, repeal Obamacare. "93% of people, when given this as against some other possible budget cut, choose this. 93% favorability. Number 2, cut out duplicative purchases of obsolete Pentagon supplies. They waste a lot of money in the Pentagon on supplies. That wouldn't necessarily eliminate any weapons programs, just waste. Number 3, privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. 81% favorability rating. Number 4, eliminate the Department of Education. That always gets the biggest line in our town hall applause line. Number 6, block grant Medicaid. Number 7, your ethanol tax credit makes the top 10 list. Number 8, close down unused and underused federal buildings. Number 9, eliminate HUD. And number 10, eliminate earmarks. So there you have it, the top 10 cuts. And guess how much you would save if we did those 10 things? $6 trillion over 10 years, as much as the Paul Ryan budget, and 5 times as much as the super committee is being asked to do. Last little point on this, left, right, and center, people agree on these cuts. Oops, sorry. Oh, shoot. There we go. These 7 items are agreed by people who describe themselves as Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and liberals, or libertarians, excuse me. And they're some of the same ones you saw on the general top list. These 7 cuts would save $4.7 trillion over 10 years. And this is left, right, and center. So, again, there is popular support for doing this. If we have to do it, these are where the priorities are. Now, I have to finish with just saying there's not a lot of support for doing deep cuts in Medicare and Social Security. And there's not a lot of support for deep cuts in defense, at least among those who took this survey. But I believe there is hope, because when people are forced to choose, they will make serious choices. And what needs to happen, long-term, I believe, is people need to understand that these big entitlements are not legally vested rights. They are not legally enforceable property. They are essentially welfare programs. And the private sector, as we've seen in Chile and other countries, can deliver better benefits with the same or better security. Ladies and gentlemen, there is hope, and we thank you for supporting the Tea Party movement.
Well, we had a very wonderful panel here, and so I'm glad that all of you were able to get up so early and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. What we're going to do now is we're going to have questions, and we have two lovely young ladies here that will be walking around with microphones. So if you'll raise your hand, and if you will wait until you get the microphone, and if you're addressing it to the entire panel, let us know that. If you're addressing it to a particular person on the panel, let us know that.
Thank the panel. That was an outstanding presentation. And this is directed at the whole panel. I am very curious about your opinion on Paul Ryan's budget. I personally thought there were a lot of excellent items in it, but given the highly charged sense of politics around it, what do you think can happen in the short term and the long term? And again, this is directed for the panel. Thank you.
Can I go ahead and take that? The Paul Ryan budget, we at FreedomWorks supported strongly, but it disappointed us in some ways. He took Social Security off the table. He took defense off the table effectively. So a lot of his cuts were focused on Medicare. And interestingly, he didn't generate much savings there in the first 10 years. His reforms didn't even start until after the 10th year. And all he did was basically give seniors more choices of competing private insurance plans. So basically making Medicare a better, more efficient benefit. And for this, there were ads run on TV by the left saying we were throwing grandma off the cliff. So the mildest possible thing, but there was one flaw from our perspective in Paul Ryan's Medicare plan. He didn't make it voluntary. He just puts everybody in this new competitive system. Medicare is not voluntary as it is. You don't have a choice. You go into Medicare or you lose your Social Security benefits. A lot of people don't know that. And so for us, we would say go ahead and let people opt into a Paul Ryan-like system. In fact, that system is already set up. It's called Medicare Advantage. But encourage people to go into it and also give them the freedom to opt out of Medicare altogether and have their own good private health insurance outside the system.
Just want to give you an idea of how much trouble we're in. I like Paul Ryan's plan a lot. I think his first roadmap was better than his second roadmap, which was better than the actual budget he produced because he had to sort of compromise politically to get there. But his plan, if his plan had passed, our national debt would have increased by $7 trillion over the next 10 years, which shows how much trouble we're actually in.
I basically agree with everything that Dean and Michael said. The one thing I want to add is that I would like to see the Department of Defense become the Department of Defense and not the Department of Offense. And I think we could save hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and I'd like to see someone go after that seriously. We are subsidizing Korea, whose GDP is 40 times that of North Korea. We're subsidizing Britain, Germany, Italy, and we're in a bunch of wars without really much reason anymore for being in those wars. And I think we could cut the Pentagon defense spending, I should say military spending, from about $700 billion a year to about $250 or $300 billion a year.
This is not a new idea. Back when John Kasich was the chairman of the House Budget Committee and was going through negotiations with Clinton, and Clinton shut the government down and blamed it on the Republicans. John Kasich had a dynamite interview on PBS where he described those negotiations, and it was quite enlightening. But he had a plan to abolish the Commerce Department. He said this would give the Congress cover if they just abolished the whole department. And this was his way to end corporate welfare, which was started years before, and it was given to multinational corporations such as McDonald's and ADM and everybody else to help them compete in the global market. Those payments are still being made to all of those huge corporations when I don't think they need help in the competing in the global market. So I would suggest that you add to your list of priorities to abolish the Commerce Department, transfer what needs to be in the State Department to them, and once and for all, get rid of global corporations receiving taxpayer dollars really as just a gift.
Yeah, can I take that one, and anyone else? Yeah, corporate welfare is a problem. The relationship between government and corporations naturally tends to become corrupt. Crony capitalism is a recurring problem and a current problem. So we at FreedomWorks would totally agree. And by the way, folks all over the country in our field hearings, our town halls on the budget, make the same point that you just did. I would mention that of all the budget plans we saw this spring, from Paul Ryan all the way over to Rand Paul of Kentucky, the only one that actually eliminated any cabinet agencies was Rand Paul's. He eliminated 4 departments, not only commerce, which you mentioned, but also energy, education, and HUD. His father, Ron Paul, has now outdone him. He would add interior to that list.
My corporate finance students this fall helped them understand the time value of money. Did a first version of extrapolating out what our current entitlement programs look like and so forth. And it's a very simple exercise. And what they've arrived at is if we had 4.5% growth in the economy between 2013 and 2020, based on some fiscal conservative getting into the White House in next fall and so forth, we would end up with a $21.5 trillion GDP in 2020, and at 15% taxes, we would end up with about $3.3 trillion of income coming in. And yet they've now extrapolated out all these entitlement programs, and of course it's untenable to keep going with that. And I'm wondering, why is it that the current Republican field that's in the process of these primaries don't understand the window of opportunity they have to be the person that goes right out to the American people and lays these numbers out and makes it aware to everybody on these national audiences as opposed to these smaller conservative get-togethers that we have. And I just wonder why no one has that kind of fortitude to lay this all out and make it very clear to the American people. And I wonder what your thoughts would be on that.
Could I? Well, first of all, I think it's a great idea, but if I've watched almost all the debates and probably 70 to 80% at least of each debate, and they don't get time, and they can't use props. I mean, look at how effectively Dean used pictures and showing you numbers, and they can't do that. And so I think that's the answer to your question. And certainly I think Ron Paul has enough courage. I don't think Romney does. I'm not sure who else does. Probably Gary Johnson does, but he's not in those debates. But anyway, I think that it takes some doing. Remember, Reagan did that in '81 when he compared the Democrats' tax rate cut with his own tax rate cut. He went on national TV, did it very effectively. So you're right, it can be done, but you got to have time.
Let me give you the one cautionary note, and that is the problem is that the benefits are given primarily to people who vote, and the bill is given to people who don't. The likelihood of a person's voting is roughly the equivalent of their age. 70% of 70-year-olds vote and 30% of 30-year-olds vote, and it's pretty much aligned. And as long as that's the case, congressmen and presidential candidates are always going to pander to the 70-year-old, and they are going to pass that bill on to the 30-year-old. To show you just how bad it is, at one of the debates, I think it was the CNN debate, they asked about the Medicare prescription drug benefit of George Bush, which adds $17 trillion to the unfunded liabilities of the Medicare program. Every one of the candidates that they asked, even Ron Paul, they all said, oh no, I would not repeal the Medicare prescription drug benefit. Ron Paul said, well, if we cut spending on foreign military adventures, we'd have the money to be able to pay for it. And the others just said, oh no, we're in favor of Medicare prescription drugs for seniors. So I mean, nobody's willing to take on You know, there's an ad running right now. If you all seen it on CNN, you know, we're 50 million AARP members. You know, that terrifies candidates for office.
Yeah, can I riff on that? I do think the one thing that produces real change is fear in the heart of a politician. And the one thing that produces fear in the heart of a politician is the prospect of unemployment. So, so we at FreedomWorks focus on that. We want to help align their fears with our hopes. And and just one shameless plug, FreedomWorks is the only group on the right whose endorsement of a candidate actually moves numbers. Two studies now have shown this. Our endorsement adds 2 to 4 percentage points to a candidate's vote total. So if you're thinking of running for office next year, come see us.
I have another shameless plug. My name is Kwa. I'm from Sterling College in Kansas. And this is the first time I've been here. And I want to express my appreciation for the classy presentations and organization by Hillsdale. And I hope that you send your children to Sterling College so that we can have a budget surplus. My questions are interrelated. Number one, in business, for example, when we talk about budget, the expense part is the part that we can actually control. And I know we talk a lot about taxes and expenses. What kind of emphasis should we put in expenses control? And number two, if we look at our history, it is very, very clear the economy is going to go up and down. Should we really have a budget and a budget surplus so that we might cushion this kind of event? And the third one is, the Bible says, for example, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10, those who will not work, they shall not eat. And that is for those who are able, of course. How would that impact the budget, the economy, and what we are talking about?
Let me address the spending portion. Now, people talk about we have a revenue problem in Washington, and it's true. Revenues are down at a very low level, primarily because of the economic slowdown, a little bit because of the Bush tax cuts, but primarily because of the economic slowdown. We're down at the low end of those charts that David was showing. CBO projects that by 2020, we're going to be at 20.8% of GDP in terms of revenue. And that includes, by the way, if we extend the Bush tax cuts and we abolish the alternative minimum tax, we will still be at 20.8% of GDP by 2020, which is about 2 points higher than the historic average. And we would still have an enormous deficit because federal spending will be at 25% of GDP in 2020. So, you know, does anyone think that the problem is on the revenue side rather than on the expenditure side? You know, when you have those numbers. I mean, clearly it's a question of reducing government spending, not a question of how can we raise more taxes.
Yeah, I think you cannot balance the budget by raising taxes. Cannot be done unless you pass a VAT. I'm trying to draw David Henderson out on his iron law.
Well, okay. So let me just respond, because Dean made a big point of it in his talk about my iron law. It is always true that if you look at an historical period and try to project it forward, you're taking a risk. And I think, frankly, Dean put his finger correctly on the risk. I'm talking within the current way we raise or lower taxes, namely income taxes and corporate taxes and so on. But I do think that a VAT is a game changer. And by the way, who's this guy in the Republican primaries who's pushing a VAT? It's Herman Cain. And I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah, I can hear the grumbling out there already. It's sold as a national sales tax, but if you actually look at the way it's assessed, it's essentially a business profits tax, and it's at each level of production. So it's functionally the equivalent of a VAT. It really is.
Right.
Yeah, and even if it is just a national retail sales tax paid at the cash register, Kane's 999, it will evolve into a VAT, I think, just as they did in Europe. Those European VATs, I think all of them, or most of them, started out life as cash register sales taxes.
Okay, we'll have one last question.
Over the past several years, we've seen a lot of people being relieved from debt through foreclosure, filing bankruptcy. And it's been my impression that, in using Mr. Clancy's words, there's not the fear in the heart of the American people when they consider a default by the American government. Do you agree with that? It doesn't seem like people think that that's such a bad thing. And what can we do to educate people or to make it obvious that the debt relief that's been going on an individual basis and is not necessarily going to be the same as what it would be for the government if we did default on everything?
Okay, so I would rather see the kinds of reforms happen that Dean Clancy talked about than to see a default. I tend to be a glass half full kind of person. So when you look at an issue of default, I start thinking, well, are there any good aspects of that? And I think the good one is, well, there are two good ones. The one I talked about, which is you then have essentially a balanced budget amendment with teeth. But the other one is, if they default, what else do they not do? Think about Mike Tanner's 3 kinds of debt. If they default on the debt that they're legally obligated to pay, they might also default on some of those other programs. And so it's messy, it's ugly, and it's why I have a very high saving rate even at age 60. But it might be, and I hope Dean's method works, and more power to you. But if it doesn't, here's this other thing that could work. So I see it as an extreme, not that I want that extreme, I'm just saying it might actually have some good aspects to it.
There would be dominoes that would go. I mean, there's banks and pension funds and all these that hold government debt, all of which would be in trouble.
To the extent they held treasury bills.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I totally agreed with David's point in his talk and just now that default is not the worst possible option. In the great debt ceiling debate of this past summer, I personally do not believe that we would have defaulted. I believe that August 2nd was a false deadline, and Congress was played for dupes on that, and they fell into the left's trap. But default isn't a great thing. But it should never be taken off the table, because if it is, you lose all your leverage. And if a government does default, what's the real result? People learn not to trust that government.